It's just a science project.
Silent breed is people!
You know, a doctor friend once said the same thing to me. Frankenstein was his name.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
That sounds like something out of science fiction.
Please explain to me the scientific nature of the whammy.
We live in a spaceship, dear. So?
Yes, science!
Program complete. Enter when ready.
Hello and welcome to episode 224 of Science on Top. Today is Sunday, the 1st of May, 2016. I'm Ed Brown and I'm joined by Dr. Shane Joseph.
Hello.
Penny Dumsday.
Hello.
And Lucas Randall.
G'day.
And coming up on the show, a newly discovered moon around a distant dwarf planet, plants that can use ants to defend themselves, and the child-rearing habits of large dinosaurs. But first, Lucas, it's been a big week for Elon Musk. Firstly, he revealed on Twitter. Iron Man, Tony Stark. Anyway. So on Twitter, he revealed that the latest update for the Tesla Model S has a secret Easter egg that activates a psychedelic rainbow mode on the autopilot display. But even cooler was the tweet from SpaceX, which reads, "Planning to send Dragon to Mars as soon as 2018. Red Dragons will inform overall Mars architecture. Details to come." Now, we've heard Elon talk about sending rockets to Mars before, but Lucas, this is the first time that there's been a date attached to it.
If you hadn't been following the SpaceX program, at least, with some degree of interest, you may have pictured that there were actual red dragons making decisions about this program, which I think is actually pretty cool.
Yeah, this is the Game of Thrones spoiler here. This is
it's not. Yeah. And that, well, if it was, at least 2/3 of the dragons would be dead by the end of the season. But anyway, so 2018 is, in case you're not aware, it's 2016 now. So let me see, 2018. That's very close.
That's very close.
Very close. The thing is, SpaceX has been going, doing their thing for quite some time, and we've seen them in the news probably for the last 12 months or so, I think, trying to land on little platforms, little barges at sea for quite some time. So they finally did on this stuff. They finally did. I mean, and they've basically all of the failures all give you data, which is really important, so that you make corrections. But they've actually, they've collected quite a lot of data, and they're really. Some things have slipped. I mean, this is one of the things with private versus government, programs like this. Private does tend to, I hear the phrase, kick the ball out, quite often. They just get it out there and let's just chase the ball. Let's chase the target, rather than government, which tend to be. Except in the case of things like, the NBN, they tend to be more conservative in their promises to what they're going to do. Certainly, organisers like NASA are fairly conservative, but they're also really, really costly. So for quite some time, there's been this scaling back of investment by NASA in getting things to space. And we saw this, once they shut down the shuttle program, they had intended for some period of time to build a whole new launch system. But in the end, it basically got canned because it just went, budget overrun after budget overrun. And we're getting into the billions and billions of dollars being spent on this launch system. And that was just to get to orbit. As well. Yeah, exactly. And that was just to get to orbit. So it seems now that, a few of these private organizations have come out of the woodwork saying, look, you know what, we can get you to space. We can do the launch. And now SpaceX has been almost routinely doing trips to the space station anyway, with its reusable componentry. It's become more of a case of, well, you want to get something there, we'll deliver it for you. We're like a courier system. So it's not a huge extension of that to get to Mars, at least to get into orbit of Mars. It's actually not that hard. The Indians, the Indian space program did it on their first try when they sent their probe over but they didn't land it. That's actually the really hard part. So launching, it's going to be difficult. They haven't actually used their Falcon Heavy rocket yet, which is actually 3 Falcons strapped together effectively to make one really, really big rocket, but with a whole heap of engines, which will be its own challenge. And that's scheduled for, I think, its first test later this year. I haven't actually been able to finds an actual date that it's scheduled for, but that's when that's meant to be happening. So getting it to Mars is not really seen as a major concern, assuming they can get through what they need to do with the Falcon Heavy. But landing is a completely different matter. And Ed, you and I were at the Deep Space, when Curiosity landed, we were up in Canberra, and we experienced some of the
nail-biting tension.
Was it how many minutes of terror? Was
7
it
minutes.
40? 7 minutes of terror, as was what they were calling it at the time, which is the period of time during which we wouldn't actually know whether Curiosity had managed to land. And it did, and that was great. It got there, and it all deployed, and all the systems worked. But this was a probe that was something like 900-ish kilos, which is a record. I mean, that's a big thing to send and land to Mars. But and if you recall, they had this crazy landing system where it was kind of there were rockets that would fire as it got closer to the planet's surface, and then they would lower it on this crane thing. It just sounded bizarre. It sounded like something the Coyote would build, to get it down. But there were reasons they did it that way, because the challenges of Mars are you've got a very thin atmosphere. You do have less gravity to deal with, so that's a good thing. But you do have a very, very thin atmosphere, and considering how fast you've got to accelerate things to get there within a reasonable time frame, once it gets there, you've got to decelerate really, really quickly, and that's part of the challenge. So what SpaceX are proposing is a delivery system where they basically the new Dragon probe, or the actual payload, would have a series of rockets on it which would effectively land in much the same way as we're seeing them land on the barge successfully most recently. So that's going to be the hard part. The industry as a whole appears to be reacting with very reserved enthusiasm. I think they're pretty much saying, look, it's possible. It seems really unlikely they'll make 2018, but the reason 2018 is important is because it's really the next launch window to get to Mars while it's relatively close to Earth. If they miss that launch window, they're really then out another 2 or so years after that before they can do it. But in overall technology terms, that's actually not a huge amount of time. So if they miss 2018, and I think there's a very good chance they will, then only 2020 they can hit it again. So
it's also, I mean, as I'm sure you guys and a lot of our listeners have no doubt bought a couple of cars from Tesla, you'd know that with Elon Musk, you always add a few extra years to any deadline that he gives.
Right, exactly. And the thing is, it's when it comes to the building the hysteria and building the enthusiasm and the interest of the market, then hey, he's really good at that. As you've just said, with things like Tesla, there's been many launch dates and so forth that have slipped, but does it turn people off it? Does it make people go, well, that's it, I'm not getting a Tesla now because they're 18 months late delivering? Not at all.
They still get the job done.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, look, I think it's really exciting. I think it's great that we're at a point now that this sort of mission could be considered routine enough that a private organisation could do it, a privately funded organisation could do it, and they do it in collaboration with NASA as well. I should point out there's not a monetary exchange between NASA and SpaceX, but they're going to be using NASA's deep space communications network in order to track it and to communicate with the probe and so forth. They're also going to be reusing a lot of technologies from NASA, and NASA engineers and consultants are involved from an advice perspective as well. I think it's really just a sign of things to come.
As part of that information exchange, in return, NASA is getting landing data and information from SpaceX. So it's a two-way street.
Absolutely. In the long term, it means that if they can do this, then because if you compare this with NASA's plans, by 2018, NASA are hoping to have another rendezvous with the moon. So if and that would be, I mean, I guess in some ways a little embarrassing that Elon Musk could send a lander to, like a really big one of several tons, and land it on Mars whilst NASA have just got back to the moon after first getting there in the 60s, then that probably... Well, it certainly would change their plans, I suspect, because that whole moon thing was like, well, we have to incrementally get to it and so forth. But, I think maybe if they're on track for this, then perhaps the moon thing doesn't need to occur in quite the same way, or maybe it will become more of a, this is really about colonizing, putting a permanent base on the moon and that sort of thing. But
there's no reason why the two missions can't exist at the same time. I mean, Mars. NASA has also said that they are planning to send humans to Mars by 2030 or so, in the 2030s. So there's no reason why they can't still go to the moon, still do science on the moon.
Yeah, absolutely.
I just think learn about that.
It seems we're on track for the delivery vehicles to be private vehicles, and NASA can then worry about science and doing things that are new. And this, there's been many commentators. I've heard people like Neil deGrasse Tyson and Phil Plait talk about this in the past, that it's perhaps time for NASA to focus more on the space, on the science we want to do in space, than actually getting to space. And we're totally seeing that now. This is becoming, and I think it will become fairly routine quite soon. And if whether or not they manage to do this the first time, make no mistake, it won't be long, and they'll be doing this. And then we will be talking about, well, on the next run to Mars in X months. I totally think that's what's in our future and not too far away at all.
Definitely. Just going back to the technological side of things, you mentioned that probably one of the biggest hurdles is landing a 2-ton craft on Mars, when the biggest we've done so far is 900 kilos. One of the very smart things that SpaceX has been doing is, while they've been doing all this research with landing the rockets here on Earth, which have been done as part of delivering cargo to the space station and launching satellites and things, they're piggybacking their own research on these commercial launches. They're actually using the part of the atmosphere from about 50 kilometres up. There's about 20 kilometres where the atmosphere here is as thin as the atmosphere on Mars. And they're firing the rockets and testing them, returning and slowing them down in that portion of the atmosphere, if that makes sense. So they're using all the opportunities they have to get as much testing and as much data as they can, which is a really smart and efficient way to do it.
Absolutely. I mean, and we do this quite routinely on Earth. We find analogues for Mars on Earth. There's certain, deserts and so forth that are very commonly used for testing vehicles, and that's been established for quite some time. So it makes perfect sense. The craft, though, is not too. It's about 6 ton. This craft. It's a very it's a significantly larger than the 900-ish Curiosity. So
that's why you can't just put them in an inflatable beach ball like the first rovers.
Was it Pathfinder or Spirit and Opportunity that were in the
Spirit and Opportunity balls? Were in the beach balls.
Yeah, they were cool.
But of course, we've used jets before. The Vikings landed on jets, but they're a lot smaller.
Yeah.
How heavy were the first moon landers?
The first moon landers, I have no idea.
No.
Don't know off the top of my head. Oh, are you talking about the actual the lunar modules in the Apollo program?
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I'll look it up though, because I'm curious myself. But obviously one of the big differences there is you had people, actually in them who could make corrections and changes.
Of course,
and you certainly wouldn't have relied entirely on the computer, because if memory serves, it
wasn't a particularly sophisticated
with
computer.
Apollo 11, they had a computer crash in the middle of the landing. It's like, oh crap, the computer's crashed. That's all right, I'll go manual. That's
the other key difference, of course, is you can land something remotely on the moon because it's a lot closer. But if it takes 7 minutes for your instructions to get to Mars, feedback from that is another 7 minutes, it's a lot more complicated and difficult. So it would be automated anyway.
God, I thought I got a shock then. I found a stat for the mass, the on-Earth mass of Apollo 11, and I thought, oh my God, that's ridiculous. But they're actually talking about the whole Saturn V rocket. That makes more sense.
How much was that, Lucas?
The Saturn V rocket, and I assume that's with payload, was 239,000 ton.
Oh,
so 239. 239 tons.
I thought, that's
1,000.
Yeah, 239 ton.
Right, okay.
That's empty. Okay, so with payload, it was
more.
Holy crap! Sorry, that's the payload was really. So it must be mainly the fuel.
Yeah.
So it was 2.7 million kilos.
Oh crap! That's insane.
Yeah, that's mental.
Yeah, that's pretty mental.
Well, but then I guess sending something to Mars is going to be just as huge.
Yeah,
if not more so. So I don't know how big the Falcon Heavy is going to be, the actual rocket system propelling it there. And obviously the actual capsule that will land there is only 6.5 tons, but big.
So, yeah, the lander was initially 15 ton. The Apollo, that was at launch. So I'm not sure what it ended up being or what changed when it actually landed. But yeah,
that's
quite
still
a lot
bigger than I would have thought. So.
Yeah.
Anyway, back down to Earth and Penny. Let's be honest. There are few things more useless than a newborn baby. No, I'm serious. They can't walk, they can't talk, they can't fight, they can't do anything to protect themselves. They're entirely reliant on other people to feed and protect them.
Oh, tell me about it.
But new research says that maybe dinosaurs were a lot more resilient when they were first born, and in fact, some of the families would have just left their eggs to hatch and the babies to survive on their own in a harsh environment.
Which in itself is not that surprising. That's a strategy that a lot of animals and plants too take, is you can either have a couple of babies and really invest in them, or have quite a few and just say, oh, you're on your own, kids. Mm-hmm. So that in itself, I'm not surprised. But what I thought was really interesting is the way that was able to be worked out for this particular species. So we're talking about a species called Repetosaurus kraussii, I believe, which is one of the titanosaurs, which are like a Apatosaurus or Brontosaurus. I can't remember which one we're meant to call it now.
I think now Brontosaurus is correct.
It's back?
It was deprecated, but now it's come back.
Okay, anyway.
You can say Brachiosaurus as well if you wish.
I'm sure everyone knows what I mean if I say Brontosaurus.
Thin at the ends, big in the middle, thin at the end.
Yeah. So a lot of baby Repetosaurus fossils have been found, and that helps, the more data you have, the more you can start to work things out about what was going on. And how did they figure out that these babies were relatively independent? They start off at about 3.5 kilos, which is just sort of the size of a human baby, but within a couple of months will be 40 kilos. So, for reference, a human child might take a couple of years, well, several years to get that big, and they seem to grow pretty quickly. So it's possible to estimate based on their size, it's how long it lived and when they died, these babies, and so on. And also by looking at the stress on the bones. So there's a line called hatchling line, which reflects the first kind of stress that the dinosaur had when it was coming out of the egg. And then rather than kind of lying around in a nest while its loving parents bring it food like a baby bird, it looks like from then on, these dinosaurs, their bones have been remodeling themselves under stress, just like our bones do, suggesting that the animals were pretty active.
Well, I would have thought there'd be a huge amount of stress just in growing from 3.5 to 40 kilos in such a short amount of time. But
I guess there could be. I mean, I don't know much about that. They seem to imply that the kinds of stress they saw reflected activity.
Okay.
But
well, presumably
I haven't.
Can tell.
Yeah, presumably you can tell. I'm no expert. It also seems that one of the ones under study was starved to death because of certain changes in the cartilage, and it's just interesting. So, because what one of the outcomes of this research has been is essentially a guidebook for researchers who want to try and figure out, were the dinosaurs that they're looking at ones that kind of fended for themselves, or did they stay in a nest? And what kind of features should you look for, and what evidence, do you need to tell that? Because when you think about it, it's a very long time ago to kind of know anything about dinosaur behaviour and what they did. And you can't just go, oh, well, because something was big, it must have cared for its young, because that's not really a one-to-one thing. So I find that fascinating. And that's not to say also that no dinosaurs looked after their young. Some did, but not all of them.
This is basically just one species that they studied. I think it's kind of interesting the way that this was a researcher who was studying, was it like turtle eggs or something? And she kept finding all these dinosaurs.
Yeah, these dinosaur bits. And And apparently baby dinosaurs are actually really rare. Like, it's not common to find them. And yet, boom, here's this data set.
Yeah.
Which is pretty cool.
Yeah, I think they're pretty much like the sort of the holy grail in a lot of ways of paleontology, because there aren't many around, and it's pretty cool to find.
Yeah, and I guess
trove. Yeah.
you find the nests and the eggs, but I'm guessing the babies, they either grew up or got crunched, you know.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
But no, it's really fascinating because it makes me wonder, where did the whole sitting on the eggs and looking after them and nurturing them after they were born, when did that come in? Was that something that evolved after the non-avian dinosaurs that we're used to, or was it something that was there before them long ago and then died out as they became larger and roamed around more? Or it would be really interesting to know if we can find out information like that and trace which species,
which families.
I mean, it's purely speculation, but some of them might have done that, and some of them obviously might not have. I mean, it's
very cool. All right, Shane, let's talk about the bittersweet nightshade. A fairly common vine found all over the world in a wide range of environments. And researchers have found it has a pretty cool defense mechanism. It basically recruits armies of ants to protect it from slugs and flea beetles and so on. What's going on here?
Yeah, well, this is not a particularly unique mechanism. There are other plants that in the plant kingdom that do this. They're called extrafloral nectaries, and I think they're like little bodies on the outside of the plant that harbour a nectar that will recruit ants that will then basically kill all the plant's predators. So it's a really cool symbiotic relationship in a lot of ways. Like, you know, it's like I give you something and in return you protect me. The difference is that this appears to be a fairly primitive form because it's not really... The nightshade doesn't have a structure for this. It just basically bleeds a nectar. And it only bleeds a nectar if you attack it with a certain kind of... like a hormone. For example, so these researchers... Well, this researcher in particular cut like a leaf with a scalpel and nectar droplets didn't appear. Like just, you know, normal sort of plant juices essentially. But as soon as the researcher coated the scalpel in a hormone that plants sort of release upon insect attack, all of a sudden this special nectar came out, which is basically sucrose. Mm-hmm. And it recruits ants. And the ants come and they crawl over it and they eat all of its, well, you know, basically protect its from its enemies. What I found really cool and kind of creepy is that this particular plant has a particularly voracious predator called the flea beetle. The ants don't attack them. So on first sight of things, you think, oh, this is pretty useless. No. What this ant is doing is attacking the larvae. It's going for the babies and killing them, nipping them in the bud.
So they lay their eggs on the leaves?
I think they lay them in the soil.
Okay.
No, sorry, that's not true. The larvae will the eggs are laid in the soil. The larvae will hatch from the soil and they'll climb into the nightshade up the plant and they'll bury themselves in the stem, and the ants will take them out of the stem and take them back to their nest. That's food. So, I guess.
Cool. Okay.
Yeah. So it's really cool. Like, I mean, so it's actually quite a sophisticated system, but it's not as sophisticated as I think like acacia trees, for example, have a very specialized kind of body that will basically harbour nectar, and that, you know, ants will come and protect them against it. But these things, like, this is just like a bleeding thing, and then it seems to be a fairly interesting. In terms of evolutionary, like, not all plants have this, and there's evidence that plants have lost this ability. So it appears to be fairly energy expensive, and that would probably be a reason why it sort of appears and disappears all the time. So it's obviously a trade-off thing. Like, you know, it would take a lot of energy to produce something like this, and to change your biochemistry essentially to produce this different kind of nectar to recruit ants. Like, it'd be quite energy expensive. So you'd have to sort of trade off as, you know, is this actually worth doing? And obviously some plants have come to not come to the conclusion, but it's happened evolutionarily that they haven't needed this mechanism, and it's just evolved, and they've evolved other means, or, you know, lost the ability. So it's really cool.
It is. I like the hands-on sort of research of, okay, if I cut with a scalpel, nothing significant happens, but if we coat it with this hormone that the tree will otherwise normally produced when it's attacked by a beetle or something.
Yeah. Well,
The
it's
ants can't.
it's funny that I think the head of this research would just noticed it in their greenhouse that these plants would bleed once they get attacked by slugs or insects, and I think they got like a student to do this work for them basically to show that this is what happens. It's pretty cool.
Use the surrounding animals and ants and that at your defense. It's very cool.
Yeah.
Okay, Lucas, let's go back into space and let's talk about the dwarf planet Makemake. It's the third largest known object. You're laughing at how I said Makemake, aren't you?
Yes.
The third largest known object past the orbit of Neptune in our solar system, and now we know it has its own moon. It's not particularly unusual for these trans-Neptunian objects to have moons. Pluto obviously has 5 that we know of, Eris has 1, Haumea has 2, but this is the first time that we've found one on Makemake, and it's kind of exciting.
Yeah, and I think when I started looking into this a little bit more after the announcement, I think it was last week the announcement came out, that I didn't realise that when what is it again? Makemake?
Yes.
Lol.
Funny.
It's just whenever I hear it, I think of the Funky Bunch. But anyway,
Oh dear.
well, when I saw, because Phil Plate did a post on this, and he actually included the pronunciation, and seeing the pronunciation written, that reminded me of South Park. It was like McKay. Anyway,
I've seen that there are like 3 different pronunciations for it. There's Makemake, there's Makemake, and then Makemake. But anyway, pick one that works.
It's humorous nonetheless. So when it was found, and I actually thought we discussed this on the show back in 2011. It was around November 2011. They made the announcement that sorry, it's not when it was discovered, but when they measured its velocity and its mass because it passed in front of a distant star. And I certainly have discussed that with somebody. I thought it was on the show, but I had a quick look through our old show summaries, and I couldn't see one around that time. So maybe we didn't. Either way, that was fairly important at the time because they were able to use that transit method to calculate the mass and the orbital velocity of something so far out, something so incredibly dim that getting a distinct read on it is very very difficult. But if if it passes in front of another object, as we know, that transit method is a very very reliable method of calculating such things. So what I didn't know was when they did that, apparently they've also done follow-up observations with infrared telescopes, which had indicated that that Makemake had some different features, which were giving off different infrared signatures. It made them think that perhaps it had some very very light areas and some very dark areas, because dark areas will absorb more solar radiation and therefore they'll appear hotter, whereas a white area will reflect more, so therefore it doesn't absorb as much heat and doesn't give off as much heat. So the impression was that, okay, there must be some really interesting features here. But now this new observation of this very, very dark moon indicates that perhaps those infrared observations were incorrect, or rather misinterpreted, because what they may have actually seen was this moon transiting in front of Makemake, which would explain why they saw this difference. It's also become clear that the angle of the orbit, at least right now, means that it's very, very difficult to spot it from where we are. And that'll change, but the thing is, it's so far out, it's going to have an orbital period of thousands of years. So it's not like it's flying across the sky and changing, the I guess the pitch, if you like, of the orbit of its moon. And if you think of, say, something closer to home with Saturn, if you look at Saturn at different times of the year, its rings are on different angles from our perspective. Same thing, because its rings are on a set angle as the thing rotates around the sun, and Earth is also rotating around the sun at a different rate. We get to see it from different angles, which is why its rings seem to pitch around. Sometimes you can see them dead on, so it's like a disc around Saturn. Other times they're side on. When they're side on, you can barely see them at all. By the way, you should really look at Saturn through a telescope if you haven't done it, because it's awesome.
Yes.
Anyway.
Sorry, just a little confused when you were talking about the orbital periods. The orbital period of Makemake is 309 years.
Really? Okay. I assumed it would be much longer
He
than
said
that. being
thousands
so
of
far
years.
out.
I was like, no, even I know that's not right.
Yeah. And the orbital
Well,
period of the moon is between 12.4 days to 660 days. I'm not sure why Wikipedia has such a vast range, but
Well, because it's not. I guess it's not really known. It's
so new. We haven't
follow-up
started.
Yeah, they need repeat follow-up observations to figure that out. So yeah, and it's just because the not knowing exactly how far this thing out is, I'm not really sure what the orbital period is because I haven't looked into it. But yeah, I mean, some of these objects are in the thousands of years that they take to go around. Which what did you say it was, 900 and something? Or?
309 years.
Right. Okay.
At perihelion, so its closest orbit to the Sun, it's 38.5 astronomical units.
Right. Okay. So that comes in relatively close, like a distance not too not far out from Pluto. So yeah. And I guess it's got a fairly elliptical orbit then. So anyway, point being that it's even with an orbital period of that, it's way beyond the lifetime of a person. So knowing, doing follow-up observations with it at different angles would be really difficult because they'd have to be very far apart. So it means, it really they're kind of waiting now for James Webb to do some better follow-up on this. Hubble's pretty good at spotting, different luminosity objects. So they'll probably have more follow-up observations with Hubble, but James Webb will really tell the story because it dips way into the infrared, and it has a much higher resolution than anything else that they've got. So, and funny we bring that up because there was another article this week about James Webb. It's mirrors ready, and it looks very beautiful.
What is it? It's an 8-meter gold mirror.
Yeah,
very cool.
Yeah. It's very pretty.
It might actually get off the ground one day.
And really expensive. But yeah, hopefully that's soon. But anyway, yeah, so what's interesting about this, obviously, is it seems that objects out in this region maybe fairly routinely have moons.
Yeah.
It's also quite interesting that its moon is quite similar to one of the moons of Pluto and Ceres. Or Ceres. I always forget how to say that.
I say Ceres.
So it may be indicative that there's a similar sort of story to how they came to be. They're not likely to have formed together because they're so very, very different. So they're far more likely to be captured objects. So yeah, it's always interesting to try and figure out what these things. I
was going to say, if something's big enough, that big, I mean, it would have enough gravity to ensnare something smaller, I guess. Just speculating.
Yeah, and obviously that's one of the characteristics of a planet. A planet is one of its defining characteristics is that it's large enough to exert enough of a gravitational influence that it clears out its orbit. So a dwarf planet obviously fails with some of the criteria, but of course, when these things are going around, they're going to start to pick up objects as well. And we see this, with Earth. There are Trojan moons, for example, in some of the in two particularly of the Lagrangian points, where just items or other orbiting things that get picked up as we move through space. So, and the other potential is that there are multiple body interactions which tend to fling stuff away. So it might fling it in towards the sun, which is where comets can come from, or it might fling it out into the interstellar space.
And also those collisions are impacts, and the debris from those impacts can come back and form into moons, which I think is what we believe happened with Haumea, which is the sort of elliptical Kuiper belt object, which has 2 moons, which are probably remnants of an earlier collision.
Yeah.
And the hypothesis that I've heard explaining why Makemake's moon has that darker charcoal lower reflectivity is that its gravity is so weak that it doesn't prevent bright volatile ices from being lost into space. So it's got that darker surface, whereas the moon, the dwarf planet itself, keeps all the ice sort of on its surface, reflecting some. So.
Any theory is a good theory at the moment because we just don't know all that much. But, I think of some of the other objects, particularly some of the moons of Saturn. There's one which name currently escapes me. I can't remember what it's called, but it's one of my favourite moons of Saturn, which is basically very, very bright, luminous on one side, and the other side it's very, very dark. Got a mental block.
I can't think of which one that would be. Not in self.
But it's that one. It's presumed is maybe is tidally locked, and it's basically clearing out space on the forward side of it, which is picking up all this dark stuff, space dust, effectively. Whereas the other side is nice, pristine ice. But there's who knows?
Yep.
Could be all sorts of reasons.
Well, we'll find out when we next send a probe out that way.
Yeah.
Or we just look at it through James Webb. All right. That's our show. As always, we'll have more information for everything we talked about today at scienceontop.com/224, and that's where all our social media links are as well. And don't forget, you can email us at feedback@scienceontop.com, and we really appreciate when you leave a review on iTunes, like Cam Brown 1 from Australia, who left a comment describing us as great science podcast for everyone. Though I'm not entirely sure we're a great podcast for homeopaths, but who knows? Maybe they'll learn something from us.
If they're interested in actual science, then probably are.
Maybe their water might remember something that we've talked about. Penny,
wow,
we're getting
we're just getting to the real snark here, aren't we? Why not?
It's the end of the show. They haven't listened this far. It's okay.
Good point. Good point.
Thank you guys once again for another great show.
Always a pleasure.
And this episode was edited with shock and awe by Marcos Beneman. And thank you everyone for listening. We'll be back again next week, putting science on top of the agenda. Join us then.
After once successfully landing a rocket on Earth and once setting it back down on a floating platform in the Atlantic, SpaceX founder Elon Musk tweeted out Wednesday that he's hoping to land one of his capsules on the surface of Mars in May of 2018.
That's not that far away.
No, that's just a couple of months. Wow. All right. So Musk said that SpaceX's long-term goal is to colonize Mars by the 2020s.
All right.